Ever since I fixed this blower, I've been telling everyone what a great blower it is and that it's been used for over a decade without any major issues and that the brand just gets a bad rap for being unreliable. Well, as expected, I was wrong about it, and it broke on me while I was using it. You'll never guess what I had to do to fix it. What's up everyone, and thank you for stopping by. Today's project is this Poulan Pro blower, and the problem is that it stopped running while I was using it. The other thing that I noticed was that it sounded really strange while it was running, at least when compared to when I first got it running. Now, in this video, we're going to try and repair this blower. However, it may not be the exact repair you need to make to yours. We'll explore other options later in the video. Now, we're only going to mention what these other options could be. We don't have enough time to look into them, but if you need more information about these options, you're welcome to ask as many questions as you need to, and if I get enough interest, I'll make a video about it, answering your questions and concerns. So the blower stopped abruptly like I had turned it off using the switch. I don't think the engine is broken because if it was, I would have problems pulling the rope, but as you can see, the engine turns over just like normal. I can also feel the engine fighting back, so I don't think I lost compression, which typically happens when you run a blower on straight gasoline in the tank, which then destroys the piston rings. My first thought was that I lost spark from the ignition system, which would make it stop the way that it did. I'm going to test that idea by using my spark tester. Now, you can find these online for just a few dollars, and to use them, install them in line with a spark plug, pull the rope a few times, and watch for an orange glow in the tester. To make it easier to see, you might want to try doing this test in the shade or in your garage. So there was an orange glow from the tester, and that means we do have spark from the ignition system. That means we have two of the three main components we need for this engine to work. The last thing I'm going to do is supply the last component, which is fuel. I'm going to spray some into the carb's throat with my squeeze bottle, then I'm going to try to start it and see what happens. Surprisingly, it started and ran for quite a long time. However, there was a weird rattling noise that it wasn't making before. I think it sounds kind of like a dirt bike. The only problem is that in this case, it's not supposed to sound that way. So this is when I noticed that the air filter base had a little bit of play in it, and at first I thought the bolts that held the base and the carb to the engine had loosened up. But then I noticed that the spark plug was also moving with the intake and the carb. Unfortunately, this was a really big problem. It meant that the bolts holding the top of the engine to the lower part had come loose. To get a better look at the issue, I'll take off the back cover so we can see what's moving. With the cover off, you can see the upper part of the engine is moving separately from the lower part. With the bolts loose, it's causing an air leak in the engine and causing it to have running issues, especially once it gets hot. To get to the bolts, there are two openings on top of the engine. The outer one is this larger opening, and the inner bolt can be accessed by a much smaller opening closer to the housing. I want to see if the bolts are loose, so I'm going to use my Allen wrench on the outer bolt since it's a lot easier to get to. And as you can see, the outer bolt was in fact loose. More than likely, the reason why the engine stopped was because there's a huge air leak here. Now I could tighten the bolt and the engine should run fine after that. However, it might get loose again in the future, so I want to put some thread locker on it. There's a huge problem though. There isn't enough clearance for my Allen wrench to get to the inner bolt. The reason is part of the rear housing is partially over the hole for it. Now I could cut down my Allen wrench, but there's a bigger problem. If you want to put thread locker on the inner bolt, you cannot remove the bolt through the smaller opening. You can only access it through the side of the engine. So if you want to put thread locker on these bolts, you need to take the entire blower apart. If you've seen past videos on this type of blower, you know what has to happen next. We need to take off the blower tube, followed by over a dozen screws and a few bolts. I would suggest using a power tool for this part because it takes a lot less time to do the repair. You can absolutely do this job with hand tools, but only if you're being paid by the hour. All the screws that go into plastic are all the same size, except the two screws that go into the lower handle. They're a little bit longer, so you can't mix them up. The only screws that you might get mixed up are the four that hold the engine to the rear housing, but you can tell these screws go into metal and not plastic because they're fine thread versus the plastic ones which are coarse thread. When it comes to the switch, it doesn't matter which connector it goes to which prong because the switch only closes a circuit to ground the ignition coil, stopping the engine. You'll also want to remove the handle from the bottom of the blower because it will get in your way when you try to remove the engine from the rear housing. I also wanted to mention that the 4 bolts that hold the engine to the rear housing requires a Torx bit, while all the others used an Allen bit. Once all the bolts have been removed, we should be able to separate the engine from the rear housing. Once the engine is away from the housing, we finally have enough clearance to use our Allen wrench to see if the inner bolt was loose, and as you can see, it turns out it was still tight. However, I'm going to loosen it and remove it because I still want to put thread locker on it. Once the bolt is loose, you'll need to use a magnet or some pliers to get it out of the engine. Before we take off the other bolt, I need to remove the muffler and a shield because the shield is bolted to the top part of the engine, and part of that shield also wraps under the edge of the lower part of the engine. With the muffler and shield out of the way, we can now remove the outer bolt. Now, since there is a chance that the base gasket might have been damaged, I'm going to remove the top part of the engine or the cylinder to have a look around and maybe inspect the piston while I'm there. You can see there's a lot of oil on this part of the engine that leaked past the gasket due to one of the bolts coming loose. I'll have to clean this up, otherwise dirt will collect here. You don't have to take the rear cover off, but it makes things a lot easier, especially when you put the engine back together. Now with the cover off, you can see the crankshaft and the connecting rod. To remove it, all you need to do is slide the piston and rod off the journal, and then we can inspect the piston. Also notice the writing on the needle bearing on the lower part of the connecting rod. You need to make sure it faces the same direction when you put it back on. So the piston looks fine, except it's covered in a lot of carbon, and more than likely it's from a fuel mixture that's a little heavy with 2-cycle oil. There's probably nothing wrong with it, but if you take a closer look, it looks like half the piston ring is stuck in the landing. The right side should look a lot like the left side, but as you can see, the ring is not extending past the side of the piston. What I'm going to do is scrub the carbon from the piston, so I'll need to remove the ring. Just be careful doing this because you can break it. Some of you would probably suggest replacing the ring, except when I did a compression test on this engine, it was almost 150 psi, which means the ring is not excessively worn out, so I don't plan on replacing it. The reason the ring was stuck in the landing is there's a lot of carbon stuck there, so that means we need to clean the landing as well. The easiest way is to just scrape the carbon out with a small screwdriver. If yours is clean, you can skip this part. Now once the landing is clean, I'll then use a soft wire brush to remove the carbon from the piston. I'm not going to show you the whole cleaning process, but I think it took me about 10 minutes, but once I was done, it looks a whole lot better now. It's not perfect, which is just fine, but I do feel better about installing it back into the engine now. The last thing we need to do is install the ring, and just to let you know, I did have to clean some carbon off the ring as well. Just remember the ends of the ring are shaped to fit a pin in the landing. If you do plan on replacing the ring, they're about $7, which is still a little bit higher than the last one I had to buy. As you can see, this is how the ring is supposed to look when it's installed on the piston. It should be able to move around in its landing. Before we install it, we need to put some oil on it so we don't damage the cylinder. I have used WD-40 in the past to do this, but use whatever you have on hand. When installing the piston back into the engine, make sure the writing on the needle bearing is facing the rear of the engine, and we're also going to install it into the cylinder first rather than the crankshaft. Just be careful because if you force the piston into the cylinder, you could break the ring. Just work the ring around the piston till it clears the cylinder. Then drop the connecting rod down into the lower part of the engine and then slide the needle bearing onto the journal. After that, you should be able to set the cylinder down on the engine against the base gasket. I did inspect the gasket and it was not damaged, so I didn't bother showing it. If it had been damaged and you need to replace it, I was able to find the gasket kit for the entire engine for about $16. For some reason, I wasn't able to find just the base gasket for sale by itself. You might be saying that I used too much thread locker on these bolts, but hear me out, I do not want to do this job again. Since this engine is in excellent shape with a great compression reading, I do not plan on opening this engine up anytime soon, and if for some reason I have to, it's only medium strength thread locker, so I shouldn't have any issues removing these Allen bolt heads. It's finally time to reassemble this engine, but I'm not going to start it just yet until 24 hours has passed. That way the thread locker has a chance to set up. Just make sure you follow the instructions for whatever type of thread locker you're using. With all the carbon that was on the piston, you think the spark arrestor screen would be clogged with carbon as well. However, in one of the past videos on this blower, I did check the screen and it was not clogged. If your blower is low on power, I would inspect your screen to see if it's partially clogged. I'm probably overdoing it, but I'm also going to put some thread locker on the screws that hold the rear cover to the engine as well. I didn't show it, but I did disconnect the fuel lines from the carb. That way it would be easier to install the piston into the cylinder. If your fuel lines are discolored, I would replace them with yellow Tygon line as they're supposed to be more resistant to ethanol fuel. If you're using a power tool to install the fasteners, just make sure you adjust the clutch settings for when you're putting screws into metal versus when the screws are going into plastic. I typically set the clutch to a fairly low setting when I put screws into plastic, that way you're less likely to damage the plastic. If you're having a problem turning off your blower with the switch, this would be a good time to take it apart and clean the contacts inside it. If you don't want to attempt such a repair, the switch would be about $10 online. However, if you were to buy it from a large electronic parts supplier instead, it'd be a lot cheaper. Once the switch is back in its location, just move the throttle linkage to its location under the switch and then install the trigger to it. Make sure you try it out before you move on, otherwise you'll have to take a lot of it back apart to fix it. We're finally ready to replace the other part of the blower housing and the last dozen screws that we have left, aside for the 3 for the rear cover. So here's another option as to why this blower would stop running while it was being used. It would be a leak at another location other than between the cylinder and the block. If the cover on the back of the engine lost its seal with the block, the same situation would happen again. And there's also a seal on the output shaft on the engine that might fail as well, letting air into the engine and causing it to stop running. Now, air is supposed to come in through the carburetor, through the engine, and out the muffler, and that's it. If there's another place where air is getting in or out, the engine will stop working. You can usually tell there's a leak because there will be a lot of two-cycle oil around the leak. So it's been 24 hours since I applied thread locker to the bolts, and I'm now ready to try and start it. The only thing we need to do now is test whether or not I need to adjust the fuel settings because I'm not sure if it was leaking during my last tuning session. For this particular carb, I need to use a splined carburetor adjusting tool, but yours might be different. When you buy these online, you usually get a bag containing several different types. That way you don't have to figure out which one you need when ordering. So the screw closer to the engine is the L screw, and it's for low engine speed fuel adjustment, so you can get it to idle and for when you rev up the engine. The screw closer to the air filter is the H screw, and it's for adjusting fuel when you have the trigger fully squeezed. This is the one we're most interested in adjusting right now. As you just saw, it looks like I had to adjust the H screw, but if you look back at the video, I pretty much put it back in the position it started at. Now, since the setting is almost the same as before, it looks like the bolt came loose after I adjusted the carburetor the first time. I've heard of these engines having this problem before where the bolts come loose and causing it to stop while in use, but you have to remember this blower is 14 years old, so if this is supposed to be a common problem, it certainly seems it took its time before it finally happened. To be honest, I still think this is a decent blower for the money. So my question is, would you have just put thread locker on the one loose outer bolt and called it done? Or would you have done what I did and taken it apart just so you could apply thread locker to the inner bolt as well? Personally, I would have just done the outer bolt and that's it, but I just wanted to show you how much work you have to do if you wanted to do the same thing to the other bolt. Thank you for watching. I really do appreciate your time here. Please feel free to ask me any questions, and I hope to see you in the next video.